What they found, sealed inside the Rothschild vault in Frankfurt in 1898. Beneath the old stone streets of Frankfurt, a wall was broken open, not by treasure hunters, not by police, not by historians. It happened inside a private vault connected to one of the most powerful banking families in Europe, the Rothschilds. For decades, that part of the underground cellar had been sealed off. No door, no handle, no sign, just a plain stone wall, cold and silent, hidden beneath a building where money, records, valuables, and family papers had been stored for generations. The workers thought they were opening an old storage space. What they found was something else. Behind the wall was a narrow chamber, untouched for more than 60 years. The air inside was heavy and stale. Dust covered the floor so thickly that every footstep left a dark print behind. Wooden crates leaned against the walls. Rolled maps rested in leather tubes. Brass instruments sat on an old table. Near the back of the room, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, were ledgers filled with names, dates, and materials that did not seem to belong in any normal banking archive. At first, it looked like a forgotten room. Then, someone opened the first map. That was when the story changed. The map was said to be dated 1707. It showed territories across Eurasia, but not the way modern maps show them. Some names were unfamiliar. Some borders looked strange. Some cities appeared where later maps showed almost nothing at all. Across a vast region was a name that has become almost mythical to those who believe parts of history were erased. Tartaria. To mainstream historians, Tartaria was an old European geographic label. It was used for large areas of Central and Northern Asia that European mapmakers did not fully understand. It was not necessarily one hidden empire. It was not proof of a forgotten super-civilization. It was a broad name placed over distant lands, but to others, that map looked different. It looked like a clue, not proof. A clue. And sometimes, one clue is enough to make people look again at everything they thought they knew. The second object made the room feel even stranger. It was a brass cylinder, darkened with age, about the length of a man's forearm. Its surface was covered with tiny engraved markings. They did not look purely decorative. They did not look entirely mathematical either. At both ends were metal rings, as if the cylinder had once been attached to something larger. When a compass was brought near it, the needle reportedly shifted, not violently. Not like a scene from a movie, just enough to make the men in the room stop speaking. A compass should not react to a dead piece of old brass, unless there was something inside it. No one knew what it was. It may have been a measuring instrument. It may have been a navigation tool. It may have been part of a larger device. Or it may have been nothing more than an ordinary object, misunderstood by people who found it in the wrong place, at the wrong time, surrounded by the wrong papers. But that uncertainty is what gave it power. A labeled object can be filed away. An unexplained object keeps breathing. Then came the ledgers. Old financial books are usually not dramatic. They contain names, dates, debts, shipments, payments, signatures. Most of them are dry enough to put a man to sleep, but these ledgers were different. Some entries mentioned ordinary goods, copper, timber, grain, machinery, textile shipments. Then, between those familiar items, appeared stranger words: electrum, orichalcum, conductive stone, atmospheric apparatus, sealed transit crates. Electrum was real. It was an ancient alloy of gold and silver. Orichalcum appears in older texts and legends, most famously connected to Atlantis. That does not mean the ledgers proved anything supernatural. It does not mean they revealed a lost empire. But it does mean that someone, somewhere, had written down terms that sounded badly out of place inside a 19th century banking archive. And that is where the mystery becomes dangerous. Not because it proves too much, because it asks too much. Why would a sealed vault in Frankfurt contain old maps of disputed territories, strange brass devices, and ledgers filled with unusual materials? Why was the room sealed behind a wall? Why were the objects not publicly displayed? Why did no museum announce a discovery? Why did so little of the story survive in official records? According to later accounts, the room was not left open for long. The items were examined privately. Some were moved, some were copied, some vanished into storage. There was no public inventory, no grand announcement, no official report that shook the academic world, just silence. And silence is dangerous around a mystery. Because when people are denied answers, they do not stop thinking, they imagine, they connect, they search for patterns. 10 years later, in 1908, another event deepened the legend. A fire. Documents connected to old archives were allegedly destroyed. Not everything. Not enough to make the story clean, just enough to leave a hole where answers should have been. That is how mysteries survive. Not through complete evidence, through broken evidence. A sealed chamber, a strange map, a brass device, a ledger with impossible words, a fire, missing papers, and a powerful family name sitting at the center of it all. The Rothschild name carries weight because it stands at the crossing point of money, politics, war, and European history. For more than a century, people have attached stories to that name. Some are exaggerated. Some are false. Some were born from fear, envy, or misunderstanding. But one thing is simple. Power attracts suspicion. When ordinary people lose records, it is called an accident. When powerful families lose records, people call it a cover-up. That may not always be fair, but it is human. The most interesting part of the Frankfurt vault story is not whether every detail happened exactly as told. The most interesting part is what the story does to the mind. Most people grow up believing history is a finished book. The dates are fixed, the empires are named, the winners are listed, the losers are forgotten. But history is not a finished book. It is a damaged archive. It is built from surviving letters, official reports, burned documents, political interests, private collections, and the choices of people who decided what was worth keeping. Sometimes a civilization disappears because it was destroyed. Sometimes it disappears because no one wrote enough about it. Sometimes it disappears because a new power needed the old story buried. And sometimes the past survives only as a rumor behind a stone wall. That is why the Tartaria connection became so powerful. For believers in hidden history, Tartaria is not just a name on old maps, it is a symbol. It represents the possibility that a more advanced, more connected, more architecturally impressive world may have existed before the version of history we were taught. They point to enormous old buildings with details that seem too costly for young cities. They point to star forts spread across continents. They point to world's fairs that appeared to build entire cities, only to tear them down soon after. They point to old photographs of grand structures standing in muddy streets, surrounded by very few people. Then they ask one uncomfortable question. Were these buildings really made when we were told they were made? Mainstream historians reject the larger Tartaria theory. They explain the maps as old geographic language. They explain the buildings through known architectural movements. They explain star forts as military engineering. They explain world's fairs as temporary exhibitions built with huge budgets, cheap materials, and intense labor. Those explanations matter, but they do not erase the feeling, because even when the official explanation is reasonable, the emotional question remains. Why does so much of the old world feel more permanent, more beautiful, and more ambitious than the world that replaced it? That is the deeper hook of this story, not the map, not the brass cylinder, not even the Rothschild fault. The deeper hook is the feeling that something was lost, maybe not a hidden empire, maybe not a forbidden technology, maybe not a secret civilization erased in one grand conspiracy. Maybe what was lost was memory. The memory of how people built, the memory of what they valued, the memory of knowledge that was not passed down cleanly, the memory of records that burned, collections that vanished, and rooms that were sealed before anyone could ask why. Picture the vault again. The workers standing in the dust, a lantern shaking in someone's hand, a map unrolled across a wooden table, a compass needle shifting near a dark brass cylinder, a ledger open to a page filled with names and materials no one expected to see. For a few minutes, the past was not dead. It was standing in the room with them, cold, silent, unexplained. Then the objects were taken away. The chamber was emptied. The wall became just another wall again, and the world moved on. But stories like this do not vanish. They wait. They wait in old books. They wait in private notes. They wait in forgotten archives. They wait in the minds of people who feel that history has too many locked doors. Maybe the story of the Rothschild vault in Frankfurt is only a legend. Maybe the map was ordinary. Maybe the brass cylinder was harmless. Maybe the ledgers were misunderstood. Maybe every strange detail has a simple explanation that was lost over time. That is possible. But even then, one thing remains true. A good mystery does not always prove a hidden truth. Sometimes it reveals a hidden fear, the fear that the past is not as simple as we were told, the fear that powerful people kept more than money in their vaults, the fear that history is not written by time alone, but by those who control what survives. So the real question is not only what they found, sealed inside the Rothschild vault in Frankfurt in 1898. The real question is this: if one sealed room could hold a forgotten piece of history, how many other rooms are still waiting behind walls we have never opened?